The retired admiral dropped his champagne glass so hard it shattered across the ballroom floor. That's how the night began. Crystal exploded beside polished dress shoes, while conversations stopped mid-sentence all around us. A pianist near the stage missed 3 notes in a row before giving up completely. I stood frozen beside the buffet table, holding a plate I suddenly couldn't feel in my hands. The Admiral was staring directly at me. Not casually. Not politely. Like a man who had just seen somebody return from the dead. My father laughed awkwardly beside him, completely unaware of what was happening. "Careful there, Tom," he joked. "Didn't mean to scare you." But retired Admiral Thomas Walker never took his eyes off me. "Impossible," he whispered. His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. Then he said the sentence that changed the entire room. "That's the woman who extracted my entire unit from Syria." Silence swallowed the ballroom whole. You could hear ice settling inside whiskey glasses. Across the room, several retired officers slowly turned toward me with expressions I recognized immediately. Recognition. Shock. Memory. My younger sister Melissa looked between us in confusion, while her husband David lowered his drink halfway to the table. Dad blinked twice, then laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, now hold on," he said. "You've got the wrong person. Caroline here worked office contracts or something." I wanted to disappear. That was the worst part. Not embarrassment. Not fear. Exhaustion. 20 years of learning how to survive quietly had taught me one thing above all else. Attention is dangerous. Admiral Walker took one slow step toward me. Older now. Gray-haired. Still carrying the posture of command. But I recognized him instantly despite the years. Northern Syria. Dust storms. Black SUVs running without headlights. Radio static screaming through broken communications. Men trapped behind shifting front lines while Washington debated liability. He looked at me carefully, almost emotionally. "My God," he said softly, "you're alive." That sentence hit harder than the recognition itself. Because some part of me hadn't fully believed it either. The ballroom at the Coronado Bay Resort suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too bright. I set my untouched plate onto a nearby table before my shaking hands dropped it too. My father stared between us now, confusion slowly hardening into irritation. "You two know each other?" Walker answered before I could. "She saved 31 Americans during the Raqqa evacuation." The room stayed silent. I closed my eyes briefly. Raqqa. I hadn't heard that city spoken aloud in years. Most people back home forgot Syria the second headlines moved on. Americans are good at forgetting distant wars once they stop interrupting dinner television. But some of us never left those places completely. "Admiral," I said quietly, "that was a long time ago." His expression changed slightly. Not pity. Something worse. Respect. "You carried one of my wounded operators across half a mile of open road under sniper fire." Dad laughed nervously again. Now I know there's some misunderstanding here. But nobody else was laughing anymore. Because military people understand tone. And Admiral Walker sounded like a man discussing the dead. I should explain something. My father loved military prestige. Loved it. Richard Hayes built a successful accounting firm in Richmond after Vietnam kept him stateside during the draft years. The fact he never served haunted him privately for decades, though he rarely admitted it directly. So instead he worshipped accomplishment. Officers. Decorated veterans. Successful businessmen. Men with stories impressive enough to repeat over steak dinners and golf outings, which made Melissa's husband perfect in his eyes. David trained Navy SEAL candidates in Coronado now after retiring from active duty, and Dad had spent the entire weekend introducing him like royalty. He trains Navy SEALs, he kept proudly telling people. Like somehow that achievement belonged to him too. Then somebody at our dinner table had jokingly asked the question, "What does your daughter even do?" And Dad, smiling into his bourbon glass, answered casually, "Honestly, Caroline never really settled into anything." That familiar little laugh afterward. The one designed to soften cruelty into humor. I'd heard it my entire adult life. She drifts around. Government contract work, mostly. Could never stay in one place long. Smart girl, just never found herself. The Admiral interrupted my thoughts gently. "May I sit with you?" I wanted to say no. Instead, I nodded once. We moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom near wide windows overlooking San Diego Bay. Outside, sailboat lights moved softly against black water, while distant music drifted from another wedding downstairs. Walker lowered himself carefully into the chair across from me. "You disappeared after Aleppo," he said quietly. "I retired. You vanished." "That too." His old commander eyes studied me carefully now. "You still having nightmares?" That question nearly took my breath away. Because only somebody who lived through it would ask that first. Not "how are you?" Not "where have you been?" Nightmares. I looked away toward the harbor lights. "Sometimes?" He nodded like he expected no other answer. Across the ballroom, Dad still watched us uneasily while guests whispered among themselves. Melissa approached cautiously after a minute. "Caroline," she said softly, "what's happening?" I forced a calm expression. "Nothing important." Walker almost smiled sadly at that. "Still protecting everybody else, I see." Melissa looked completely lost now. "You were in Syria." Before I could answer, Dad finally walked over carrying fresh drinks. "All right," he said firmly. "I think somebody better explain what's going on." Walker looked directly at him. "With respect, Richard, your daughter prevented one of the worst military disasters I ever witnessed." Dad scoffed automatically. "That's impossible." The Admiral's face hardened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "What was impossible is that she got us out alive." Silence again. Heavy this time. Melissa stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. David slowly approached too now, his training instincts clearly picking up tension. "You really worked extraction?" he asked carefully. I hated that word. Worked. Like trauma was employment. Like Syria was a resume item. "Something like that," I answered. Dad folded his arms defensively. "Well, if any of this is true, why the hell didn't you ever say something?" There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. Accusation. I looked at him for a long moment before answering quietly. "Because every time I came home you only noticed what was wrong with me." His expression shifted immediately. But before he could respond, Walker spoke again. "Richard?" He paused carefully. "Do you have any idea what your daughter carried back from that war?" Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. Because suddenly the room had changed. People weren't admiring him anymore. They were looking at me. And for the first time in my life, my father realized the daughter he dismissed for years might have been fighting battles he never bothered trying to understand. Outside the ballroom windows, dark water rolled softly through San Diego Bay, while old memories began rising inside me like ghosts refusing to stay buried. And deep down I knew this night was only the beginning. I left the ballroom 15 minutes later without saying goodbye to anyone. Some exits become instinct after enough years around danger. You learn to recognize the moment a room turns emotionally unstable. Voices shift. Eyes linger too long. Questions start coming faster than answers. And suddenly breathing feels harder than it should. The night air outside the Coronado Bay Resort felt cold against my skin, despite the California warmth. I walked toward the marina with no real destination in mind, heels clicking softly against wooden docks while sailboats rocked gently in black water beside me. Behind the ballroom windows, life continued. Laughter. Music. Wine glasses raised beneath chandeliers. Meanwhile, my entire past had just cracked open in public like an old wound splitting under pressure. I leaned both hands against the railing near the far end of the dock and stared across the bay toward downtown San Diego, glowing in the distance. 20 years. 20 years of silent secrecy and carefully controlled distance. Gone in one evening. You always run toward water. I closed my eyes briefly. Admiral Walker. Of course. I'm not running. That's what everybody says while running. I almost smiled despite myself. He stepped beside me quietly, hands tucked inside the pockets of his blazer. Up close, age showed more clearly now. Deep lines around his eyes. Gray at the temples. Slight stiffness in the way he moved his left shoulder. Syria took pieces from everyone. Some wounds just showed slower. You shouldn't have said all that in there, I said softly. Walker stared out across the marina. I know. Then why did you... His answer came immediately. Because your father humiliated you. That surprised me enough to actually look at him. Walker sighed heavily. Caroline. I sat in command rooms watching politicians debate whether my men were worth the risk. His voice lowered slightly. I'm too old now to stay quiet while decent people get treated like they're disposable. The word hit harder than he intended. Disposable. That's exactly how many of us felt coming home. Useful overseas. Uncomfortable back here. A yacht horn echoed somewhere across the harbor. Walker glanced at me carefully. You really disappeared after Syria. I tried. You stopped answering everyone. I wasn't in good shape. That was the cleanest version of the truth. The real version looked uglier. Panic attacks in grocery stores. Sleeping with lights on. 3 failed relationships because I startled awake swinging at shadows. Changing jobs every year because sitting inside ordinary offices felt unbearable after watching entire cities collapse into violence. Walker nodded slowly like he understood anyway. You know, he said quietly, my wife used to ask about you. I frowned slightly. Why? She said nobody risks themselves that many times unless they're carrying something broken already. That sentence landed deep because it was probably true. The marina stayed quiet around us, except for ropes creaking against docks in the wind. Finally, Walker spoke again. Do they really not know? Number. Nothing. I gave a tired shrug. My family thinks I did administrative consulting. He stared at me in disbelief. You coordinated covert extractions through active combat zones. I also missed Christmas 6 years straight and got divorced twice. I looked back toward the ballroom windows. People tend to focus on what affects them personally. Walker fell silent after that. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. They don't rush to fill every empty space with noise. After a minute, he asked softly, Do you ever talk about Syria with anyone? Number. Therapist. Briefly. Friends. I laughed once under my breath. Most people stop calling after you cancel enough dinners. That seemed to genuinely pain him. You saved a lot of lives, and lost others. There it was. The real thing underneath everything else. Survivor's guilt. The permanent roommate nobody sees. Walker rubbed a hand slowly across his jaw. You remember Sergeant Miller? I stiffened immediately. Yes. His daughter just graduated nursing school. I looked away fast toward the water. Sergeant Ben Miller. 41 years old. Minnesota National Guard attached to Special Operations support during the Syria evacuation. Funny. Loved old country music. Carried photos of twin daughters inside his vest. Dead 37 feet away from me after mortar fire hit our convoy route outside Raqqa. Walker's voice softened. You blamed yourself for that. I changed the route. You changed it because the original road was compromised. He still died. The Admiral looked at me carefully. That's war. No, I answered quietly. That's leadership. We stood there silently afterward while cold wind moved through the marina. Eventually, footsteps approached behind us. Dad. Even before turning around, I knew by the rhythm alone. Richard Hayes always walked like a man late for a meeting. He stopped several feet away awkwardly. I figured you might be out here. Neither Walker nor I answered immediately. Dad looked uncomfortable standing on the dock in his expensive blazer and polished loafers, like somebody accidentally dropped him into another life entirely. Finally, he cleared his throat. Mind if I talk to my daughter? Walker glanced toward me. I nodded once. The Admiral squeezed my shoulder gently before walking back toward the resort alone. Dad watched him leave. Then exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, this has been one hell of an evening. I stayed quiet. He leaned beside me against the railing. You could have told us. There it was again. Not what happened to you. Not, are you okay? You could have told us. I stared at dark water moving beneath the dock. Would it have mattered? His face tightened. Of course it would have mattered. You sure about that? Dad rubbed his forehead tiredly. Caroline, don't do this. Do what? Turn this into an attack. I laughed softly at that. Because to him, honesty always sounded like attack. You spent years introducing Melissa like she was proof you succeeded as a father. My voice stayed calm. Then you introduced me like an apology. That's not fair. No, I finally looked directly at him, Tonight was the first time I've ever seen you curious about my life." He opened his mouth immediately, then stopped, because he knew I was right. Wind moved across the marina, carrying distant music from the ballroom. Dad stared down at the water for a long time before speaking again. "When you came home from overseas," his voice slowed carefully, "you changed." I almost smiled sadly. That was the understatement of the century. "You became cold," he continued quietly, "distant, angry all the time. I was traumatized." The word hit him visibly. Traumatized. Not dramatic. Not unstable. Traumatized. Dad swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "No," I agreed softly. "You didn't ask." Silence stretched painfully between us. Then very quietly he asked the question that should have come years earlier. "What happened to you over there?" I closed my eyes. And just like that, Syria came flooding back again. Dust. Gunfire. Smoke rolling through shattered streets. Children crying beneath concrete buildings with no roofs left. And 31 trapped Americans waiting in darkness while radio communications slowly died one by one. I opened my eyes toward the black California water. "A lot," I whispered. For the first time in my adult life, my father stood beside me without trying to correct, criticize, or compare me to someone else. And somehow that hurt worse than every insult combined. Syria smelled like burning plastic and diesel fuel. That's the first thing I remember now. Not politics. Not missions. Not patriotism. Smell. Funny what the brain saves after trauma. A cheap air freshener in a taxi can drag me backward 15 years before I even realize what's happening. Smoke from a roadside grill, hot engine oil, fireworks after dark. Suddenly I'm not in California anymore. I'm back inside a collapsing city, listening to distant gunfire echo between concrete buildings, while grown men try not to panic over broken radios. Dad stood beside me on the marina dock, waiting quietly. I think older people understand something younger generations often miss. When somebody finally begins telling the truth after years of silence, you don't interrupt them. "You remember when I disappeared in 2017, I asked softly. Dad nodded slowly. "You told everyone I was doing consulting work overseas." "That's what you said." "Because it was easier." Wind moved cold across the water while lights shimmered across San Diego Bay. I stared down at my hands resting against the railing. They attached me to a joint extraction program operating near the Syrian border. I paused briefly, mostly recovery operations, evacuations, asset relocation. Dad frowned slightly. "You mean military rescue missions?" "Sometimes." The truth was messier than that. Officially, half the work didn't exist. Unofficially, people died constantly. I closed my eyes briefly. The operation Walker mentioned wasn't supposed to happen. And suddenly I was there again. Northern Syria. October 2017. 3 American vehicles disabled outside Raqqa after local intelligence collapsed mid-operation. Enemy forces shifting faster than expected. Multiple teams trapped without secure extraction routes. Command hesitated. Too dangerous. Too politically sensitive. Too expensive. War always becomes accounting eventually. Walker's unit spent 14 hours pinned inside an abandoned textile warehouse, while drone surveillance failed repeatedly due to weather conditions and electronic interference. No reliable exit. No air support. No guarantees. Dad listened silently now, expression tightening more every minute. We had local contacts still operating smuggling corridors near the Turkish border. I continued quietly. Old civilian routes, some were still usable. "You organized the rescue." "I organized transportation." That sounded smaller. Safer. Less personal. But Dad looked at me carefully. "That Admiral said you carried wounded soldiers." I swallowed slowly. Because once memories start moving, they don't stop politely. One of Walker's operators took sniper fire crossing a street near the industrial district. Femoral artery damage. Losing blood fast. Vehicles couldn't reach him because the road was exposed. So I went myself. Not bravery. Necessity. People misunderstand that all the time. Most acts labeled heroic happen because somebody runs out of alternatives. "I got him into a transport van," I said softly. "That's all." Dad stared at me in disbelief. You make it sound ordinary. Nothing felt ordinary anymore after enough years around death. A ferry horn echoed across the harbor while music drifted faintly from the ballroom behind us. Finally, Dad asked quietly, "How many times were you over there?" I laughed once without humor. Too many. His face looked older under the dock lights now. Not physically. Emotionally. Like invisible pieces of his understanding were rearranging themselves painfully. "You were gone all the time," he murmured. "I know. You'd come home for holidays and barely speak to anybody." I looked out toward the black water. Because my nervous system was still overseas. That sentence seemed to genuinely confuse him. So I explained, "You don't come back from places like that overnight." I searched for words he might understand. "Your body keeps waiting for danger long after danger's gone." He stayed quiet. I continued anyway. Crowded restaurants felt unsafe. Loud noises triggered adrenaline. I couldn't sleep properly. My throat tightened slightly. Sometimes I'd wake up convinced somebody was breaking into the house. Dad rubbed one hand slowly across his mouth, and we thought he stopped himself. "What?" He looked ashamed suddenly. "We thought maybe you were drinking too much." That hurt less than it should have. Because honestly, plenty of operators did. Some still do. People numb pain however they can. "I know what you thought," I answered gently. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Then Dad asked the question buried beneath everything else. "Why didn't you trust us enough to tell us?" I stared at the water carefully before answering. Because every time I tried acting normal around the family, I failed. The words came easier now. Not because they stopped hurting. Because exhaustion finally outweighed fear. "You remember Melissa's Christmas party in 2018? Dad nodded slowly. "You snapped at Uncle Gary." He grabbed me from behind unexpectedly. I swallowed. I nearly broke his wrist before I realized where I was. Dad's eyes widened slightly. "I thought you were overreacting." "I was having flashbacks." Silence. Heavy silence. I didn't understand what was happening to me yet, I admitted quietly. I just knew I couldn't relax anymore. That was the ugliest truth about trauma. Sometimes you don't even recognize yourself. The ballroom doors opened behind us suddenly, and Melissa stepped outside carrying her shoes in one hand. "There you are." She approached slowly, clearly unsure whether she was interrupting something fragile. Dad straightened slightly beside me. Melissa looked between us cautiously. "Everything okay?" Neither of us answered immediately. Finally, Dad nodded once. "We're talking." Melissa almost smiled sadly at how strange that sounded coming from him. She leaned beside me against the railing. "You know, half the ballroom thinks you're CIA now." I laughed softly despite myself. "Wonderful." "David's been cornered by retired Marines for an hour asking about Syria." That made me groan quietly. Attention spreads fast in military circles. Especially stories involving survival. Melissa studied me carefully in the marina light. "You really saved those men." I looked away immediately. Because that question always carried another one beneath it. "Who didn't you save?" "That operation went bad," I answered carefully. "But you got them out." "Most of them." Dad caught that instantly. "What do you mean most?" There it was. The part families never imagine when they romanticize service. Failure. Loss. The names you carry forever afterward. I closed my eyes briefly. Sergeant Miller died during the extraction. Melissa's face fell immediately. Dad looked physically stricken. "How?" "Mortar strike." The words still tasted metallic after all these years. "He had daughters," I added quietly, "twin girls." Nobody spoke. Somewhere inside the ballroom, people laughed loudly over wedding stories and old military jokes, while outside on the dock, 3 members of the same family stood facing the reality that war doesn't end just because somebody makes it home alive. Melissa finally touched my arm gently. "You carried all this by yourself." I almost answered automatically. That's what trained people do. Minimize. Deflect. Endure quietly. But tonight, honesty kept forcing its way loose. "Yes," I whispered. Dad looked down toward the dark water for a very long time. And when he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller somehow. "My God, Caroline. Not judgment. Not criticism. Just grief. Because for the first time, my father was beginning to understand that the daughter he called unstable had actually come home carrying ghosts too heavy for most people to survive gracefully. The following evening, Admiral Walker invited several guests to a private dinner overlooking the bay. I almost didn't go. Honestly, after the scene at the gala, disappearing back to Virginia sounded a whole lot easier than sitting through another room full of military stories and awkward attention. But Melissa knocked on my hotel door around 6 carrying 2 coffees and wearing the same expression she used to have when we were girls, trying to convince Dad not to cancel summer vacations after bad weeks at work. "Please come," she said softly. "People aren't talking about you like gossip anymore." "That's supposed to help." She smiled sadly. "They're talking about you with respect." That word still made me uncomfortable. Respect can become another kind of distance. Still I went. The dinner took place at a quiet seafood restaurant tucked along the marina in Coronado. Nothing flashy, dark wood walls, framed Navy photographs, old Frank Sinatra songs drifting softly through hidden speakers while sailboats rocked outside beneath yellow dock lights. The crowd skewed older. Retired officers. Military spouses. A few gray-haired veterans walking carefully with canes and old injuries. The kind of Americans who speak slower now because life already taught them what matters. Dad stayed unusually quiet during the drive over. No boasting. No forced jokes. Just silence. And honestly, that worried me more. Walker greeted us warmly near the entrance. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted again into something halfway between relief and disbelief. "You came." Melissa threatened emotional manipulation. That sounds effective. For the first time all weekend, I saw him genuinely smile. Inside dinner unfolded politely at first. Crab cakes. Wine. Stories about retirement communities and grandchildren and bad knees from military service decades earlier. Normal aging American conversations. The kind people earn after surviving enough life. I relaxed slightly after the first hour. Then Dad ruined it. Not intentionally. That almost made it worse. One of the retired colonels asked whether I still worked in government contracting. Before I could answer, Dad gave that familiar little laugh again. "You know, Caroline," he said casually, "she never stays anywhere very long." There it was. The old version of me. The unstable daughter. The difficult one. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Melissa closed her eyes briefly beside him like she already knew damage was coming. Dad kept talking unaware. "She's always been restless, smart as a whip, but..." He shrugged lightly. "Could never really settle into ordinary life." Silence spread slowly across the table. Not dramatic silence. Disappointed silence. Walker set his wine glass down carefully. "Richard," he said quietly with respect, "ordinary life stopped being an option for your daughter a long time ago." Dad blinked. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," Walker answered. "That's the problem." The table went still. Every older veteran there recognized tension instantly. Military people develop radar for emotional explosions because they spend years preventing them. Dad straightened slightly. "Well, I'm sorry if I embarrassed anyone." Walker's eyes hardened. "You embarrassed her. I wanted to stop this immediately. The last thing I needed was public defense. I'd spent years surviving without anybody protecting me emotionally. Suddenly receiving it now felt almost unbearable. Admiral." But Walker continued. "Do you know what your daughter did during the Raqqa extraction?" Dad's jaw tightened immediately. "We've already heard the story." "No," Walker said firmly. "You heard headlines, you didn't hear the truth." The restaurant had grown quieter around us now. Even nearby tables were beginning to notice. Walker looked directly at my father. My unit was trapped for 14 hours in a dead communication zone, while command debated whether recovering us was worth the political fallout. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Walker continued calmly. 3 rescue attempts failed before Caroline arrived. I stared down at my untouched food. "Please stop. Please." But older men who carried survivors' guilt rarely stop once truth starts moving. She crossed hostile checkpoints using civilian transport routes nobody else was willing to risk. Walker's voice roughened slightly. "And when one of my operators got hit..." He looked directly at Dad now. Your daughter carried him herself." The entire table stayed silent. Dad looked genuinely shaken. "She weighed maybe 130 pounds, Walker continued softly. "My operator weighed over 200 with gear." Melissa slowly covered her mouth with one hand. I could feel every eye turning toward me now. The same thing I'd spent 20 years avoiding. Recognition? Walker leaned back slightly. Most people at that point would have abandoned the wounded and saved whoever they still could. His eyes moved toward me briefly. Caroline refused. Dad looked at me differently now. Not proudly. Confused. Like the daughter sitting beside him no longer matched the version he'd spent years believing existed. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" And something inside me finally cracked. Not explosively. Not dramatically. Just enough for years of exhaustion to start spilling through. Because every time I came home, I said softly, "You acted like the problem was my personality." Dad's face fell immediately. Nobody interrupted. So I kept going. "You told people I was unstable." "Caroline." "You compared me to Melissa constantly." "I was worried about you." "No," I answered firmly. "You were embarrassed by me." The words landed like stones in water. Heavy. Final. Dad stared down at the tablecloth. I continued quietly now because anger had finally burned itself into sadness. "You saw panic attacks and called me difficult." My throat tightened painfully. "You saw insomnia and called me irresponsible. You saw trauma and decided I just couldn't adjust to adulthood." Melissa started crying silently beside me. I looked toward her immediately. "That's not your fault." But she shook her head. "Yes, it is." "Number?" "I let him do it," she whispered. "I let everybody think you were selfish because it was easier than asking why you changed." That hurt worse somehow. Because Melissa wasn't cruel. Just comfortable. And comfort makes people ignore pain sitting right beside them. Walker spoke quietly into the silence. "There are men alive today because Caroline chose not to leave them behind." Then another voice surprised me. An older Marine sitting farther down the table cleared his throat. My son was attached to support logistics during that operation. I looked up slowly. The man's eyes filled with emotion. He came home, his voice cracked, because of that extraction. The restaurant stayed completely silent now except for soft Sinatra music drifting through speakers overhead. Dad suddenly looked older than I'd ever seen him. Not physically. Spiritually. Like some terrible realization was finally settling into place. "You came home broken," he whispered toward me. I swallowed hard. "Yes, and I punished you for it." Nobody moved. Nobody rescued him from that truth. Because there are moments in life when pain finally deserves to be seen clearly. Dad rubbed trembling hands together slowly. "My God." I stared out toward the marina windows, where sailboat lights drifted across black water beyond the glass. And for the first time in my life, my father was finally seeing me not as a disappointment, but as a wounded human being who'd been drowning quietly right in front of him for years. After the dinner ended, I sat alone in the hotel parking garage for almost 40 minutes without starting the car. The engine stayed off. The radio stayed silent. I just sat there staring through the windshield while old memories moved through me like weather fronts rolling across dark water. People think revenge feels satisfying. Sharp. Victorious. But the truth is, when someone finally realizes how badly they failed you, the feeling isn't triumph. It's grief. Because part of you mourns all the years that understanding arrived too late to save. My phone buzzed around midnight. "Dad." I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered quietly, "What?" Long silence. Then his voice. "Can I come up?" I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm tired." "I know." Another silence. He exhaled shakily, "Please." 20 minutes later, he sat across from me inside my hotel room, holding untouched coffee from the lobby downstairs. No blazer now. No polished businessman confidence. Just a 73-year-old man suddenly forced to confront the possibility that he misunderstood his own daughter for most of her life. Rain tapped softly against the balcony windows while San Diego traffic hummed far below. Dad stared into his coffee cup. I keep replaying things. I leaned back quietly in the chair across from him. "What things?" All of it. His voice sounded rougher than normal tonight. Christmases? Family dinners? The way you used to leave early? He swallowed hard. I thought you were angry at us. I was. He nodded slowly. But now I think maybe you were hurting. That word nearly broke something inside me. Hurting. Not dramatic. Not unstable. Not difficult. Just hurting. I looked away toward the rain. You know what the worst part was? I asked quietly. Dad shook his head. I kept hoping somebody would notice. His face tightened instantly. Notice what? That I wasn't okay. The room fell silent again except for rain against glass. Finally, I continued. You remember Melissa's second wedding anniversary party? He nodded carefully. I disappeared halfway through because fireworks started outside. I stared down at my hands. I locked myself in your bathroom, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. Dad looked physically ill now. I thought you were being rude. I know. Another silence. Then he whispered something that sounded almost childlike in its regret. I didn't know. And for the first time in years, I actually believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Not cruelty. Blindness. My father grew up in a generation where emotional pain got hidden beneath work schedules, church attendance, and bourbon after dinner. Men his age survived by compartmentalizing everything, until eventually they lost the ability to recognize suffering unless blood was physically visible. He wasn't heartless, just emotionally uneducated. And unfortunately, that damage spreads through families like inherited debt. Dad rubbed both hands slowly across his face. When your mother died, he stopped briefly. I thought if I kept moving forward, the girls would too. I stayed quiet. She was the emotional center of everything. His voice cracked slightly now. After she was gone, I didn't know how to talk about feelings without feeling weak. That sounded exactly like him. Richard Hayes believed competence solved everything. Work harder. Stay composed. Keep functioning. But trauma doesn't negotiate with productivity. Eventually, it collects payment. Dad looked toward me again. So when you came home different every time? He shook his head slowly. I kept treating it like a behavior problem instead of pain. I swallowed carefully. You compared me to Melissa constantly. His face twisted immediately. I know. She got married, had kids, stayed close to home. I laughed softly without humor. Meanwhile, I couldn't survive grocery stores some days. Dad looked down. You scared me. That answer surprised me. What? You disappeared into places nobody could talk about. Then you'd come home colder every year. He rubbed trembling fingers together. I thought if I pushed you harder, maybe you'd snap out of it somehow. That hurt because it sounded painfully believable. Older generations often mistake pressure for motivation. Especially fathers. I wasn't lazy, Dad. I know that now. The rain outside thickened briefly. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, how bad did it get? I stared toward the dark hotel window. There are questions veterans usually avoid answering honestly because civilians don't know where to place the truth afterward. But tonight felt different. So I answered. There were months I didn't want to wake up anymore. Dad inhaled sharply. I'm not saying I wanted to die, I clarified softly. I just got tired of carrying everything. His eyes filled immediately. You went through that alone? Yes. Why didn't you call me? The sadness in his voice almost undid me completely. Because underneath all the damage, part of me had wanted exactly that for years. A father. Not a critic. Not a judge. Just a father. I didn't think you'd understand. He nodded slowly, like accepting a sentence handed down in court. You were probably right. That honesty mattered. More than defense would have. Dad stood suddenly and walked toward the balcony window, hands shoved deep into his pockets. I used to brag about other people's children constantly, he admitted quietly. Doctors, lawyers, military officers. He shook his head bitterly. Meanwhile, my own daughter was surviving things I couldn't even imagine. I watched his shoulders rise and fall slowly. When Admiral Walker looked at you, Dad paused. I realized he knew parts of you I never bothered learning. Neither of us moved. Then finally he turned toward me again. I'm sorry, Caroline. Not polished. Not rehearsed? Just broken. I'm sorry I made home feel like another battlefield. Emotion closed hard around my throat. Because that was exactly what it had felt like. For years. A place where I constantly defended myself instead of resting. Dad stepped closer slowly. I can't undo what I missed. His voice trembled openly now, but if there's still time, I'd like to know my daughter before one of us dies. That sentence hit with the quiet force only older people truly understand. Because after 60, 70, 80, time stops feeling theoretical. I stood slowly. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I hugged him. Not because everything was healed. Not because pain disappeared overnight. But because for the first time in my adult life, my father finally saw me clearly. And maybe that was the beginning of forgiveness. 6 months later, my father drove 8 hours just to help me replace a broken porch railing. That may not sound important to some people. But if you knew Richard Hayes, you'd understand it was practically a declaration of love. No speeches. No dramatic apologies. Just an old man arriving in North Carolina at 7 in the morning with a toolbox black coffee and too many hardware store supplies. That's how men from his generation often say the things they never learned to express out loud. By showing up. The little rental house I'd moved into sat near Wilmington, tucked beneath old oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Quiet neighborhood, mostly retirees, military families, and widows who waved from porches every evening around sunset. Peaceful. For the first time in years, peaceful. Healing didn't happen quickly after California. Honestly, some days it barely felt like healing at all. More like learning how to carry memory without letting it crush me completely. I started volunteering 3 mornings a week at a veterans transition center near the Cape Fear River. Mostly older veterans, Vietnam, Desert Storm, a few Iraq and Afghanistan men younger than me but somehow looking older around the eyes. Turns out trauma ages people unevenly. One Marine in his 70s used to sit alone every Thursday drinking terrible vending machine coffee without speaking to anyone. After almost 2 months, he finally looked at me one morning and said, "You move like military." That was the entire conversation. But the next week he sat beside me voluntarily. That's how trust works with damaged people sometimes. Quietly. Slowly. No grand breakthrough moments. Just consistency. Dad noticed the changes in me before I did. "You laugh more now," he said that afternoon while tightening bolts into the new porch railing. I leaned against the doorway holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "Do I?" "Yeah." He smiled faintly without looking up. "Used to feel like you were bracing for impact all the time." That sentence stopped me cold because it was true. For years, my nervous system lived like an alarm nobody could switch off. Even during calm moments, part of me always waited for disaster. Dad wiped sweat from his forehead and stepped back to inspect the railing. "Hand me the wrench." I passed it over silently. Watching him work felt strangely emotional now. When I was little, Dad fixed everything himself. Broken sinks, bike chains, fence posts. After Mom died, repairs became his coping mechanism. If he could keep the house functioning, maybe the family wouldn't collapse too. Unfortunately, people aren't plumbing. Pain leaks anyway. That evening, we grilled hamburgers on the tiny back patio while cicadas buzzed through humid Carolina air. Boats moved slowly through the waterway beyond the trees, their lights glowing soft gold at dusk. Simple life, the kind I used to think I no longer deserved. Dad sat quietly after dinner, staring out toward the water. "You know," he said, "eventually I've been thinking about something. That's dangerous." He chuckled softly. "I spent years believing strength meant hiding weakness. I stayed quiet. Probably got it from my father." He shook his head slightly. "Hell, that whole generation came home from wars emotionally half dead and nobody talked about it." That was true. Men from World War II and Korea often survived through silence because society gave them no other tools. Unfortunately, silence becomes inheritance. Dad looked toward me carefully. "When you came home struggling?" He paused. "I thought acknowledging it would somehow make you weaker." I swallowed slowly. Instead, pretending nothing was wrong made everything worse. Yes. The honesty between us still felt unfamiliar sometimes. Not uncomfortable anymore. Just new. Dad leaned back in his chair. "I actually started reading about PTSD. That surprised me enough to laugh." You. I know, shocking. What did you learn? He looked down at his hands. That a lot of traumatized people isolate because they're trying to protect others from themselves. Emotion tightened quietly in my chest. Because that was exactly what I'd done for years. Not avoiding family out of hatred. Out of fear. Fear of snapping at people, fear of ruining holidays, fear of bringing darkness into rooms that felt safe before I entered them. Dad exhaled slowly. I wish I'd understood earlier. Part of growing older is realizing regret never fully disappears. You just learn to live beside it more gently. A week later, Melissa visited with her 2 kids. Watching my sister move around my little house barefoot while her children chased fireflies across the yard healed something inside me I hadn't even realized was broken. For years I kept distance because I believed I no longer fit inside ordinary family life. Now I understood something different. Trauma may change people, but it doesn't disqualify them from love. Late that night after the kids fell asleep, Melissa and I sat on the porch swing listening to frogs near the water. I used to envy you, she admitted quietly. I blinked. You envied me. You got to escape. That stunned me. Melissa smiled sadly into the darkness. Dad put all his expectations onto me after you left. She tucked a blanket tighter around her shoulders. Perfect marriage, perfect kids, perfect life. Her voice softened. I spent years terrified of disappointing him too. That hit hard because I'd never seen her burden clearly either. Families misunderstand each other in every direction sometimes. I'm sorry, I whispered. She shook her head gently. We were both trying to survive him in different ways. The porch swing creaked softly while warm southern air moved through the trees. Then Melissa looked at me carefully. You know what changed him most. What? The shame. I frowned slightly. She continued quietly. Not because you were impressive, because he realized you were suffering and he missed it completely. I stared out into the darkness beyond the yard. Maybe that was true. Maybe the deepest pain parents feel isn't failure itself, but realizing they misunderstood their own child while there was still time to do better. The next morning, Dad prepared to drive back to Virginia. Before leaving, he hesitated beside his truck awkwardly. Then he reached into the cab and handed me something. An old framed photograph. Mom standing between Melissa and me at Virginia Beach when we were children. I stared at it silently. You should have it, he said softly. Emotion rose unexpectedly in my throat. Thank you. Dad nodded once. Then after a small pause, he added quietly, I'm proud of the woman you became, Caroline. His eyes filled slightly, not because of Syria, because you survived it, and still chose kindness afterward. That one nearly broke me. Because after everything, kindness was the part I fought hardest to keep. He hugged me tightly before climbing into the truck. I stood in the driveway watching him disappear down the quiet Carolina road beneath giant oak trees. And for the first time in decades, home no longer felt like a place I had to survive. It finally felt like somewhere I belonged again. If this story touched you, maybe take a moment to think about someone in your own life who might be carrying pain silently. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones struggling hardest behind closed doors. And sometimes one honest conversation can heal wounds that pride protected for years. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for spending this time with me.